Good afternoon. My name is David Hovel, and I am just an interested bystander in the social work world, but I've been studying new theories, new information that's been coming out in the last 20 and 30 years, and I'm really excited to share this with you today. I honestly believe that a lot of people have failed to kind of keep up with what's been happening in the world, and there's an enormous amount of new information. In fact, in many, many fields, other than things like mathematics and literature, a lot of the information that was available 20 and 30 years ago is not only out of date, it's actually invalid. So what I want to do is introduce you today to some ideas and scientific theories that are human-based, psychological theories that are recently developed that are going to change the way we look at the world of science and social work together. And the purpose of this whole talk is to try to explore the divisions that are so incumbent in human nature. Why are we a people divided by information and ideas and beliefs? I want to know. My wife, Bonnie Hovel, is going to help me try to give some clinical examples as we go along. That is not my job, and I am absolutely unqualified to do that. Why are we here today? The view from 30,000 feet is I would like to do what little I can to try to heal the gulfs that separate people. Very often I feel like, although politically I'm a little bit of a lefty, a lot of times I hear the right and the left and I sort of understand where they're coming from, but what I know is they're talking past each other. They don't get it. I kind of get it. I'm not so sure I get it, but I want to try to share what I think I know from myself and from a lot of bright people who've written great books with everyone. This specifically is not really training. These things are huge tasks in and of themselves. Things like the righteous mind and ocean are big topics with a lot of science and a lot of literature behind them. This is not training. What this is an overview to give you an orientation so that when you go look for it for yourself, you'll be halfway home. And I want to introduce you in a way that tries to encourage you to look at these things as mathematically sound theories. And I want to have a path when this is over for you to follow with further reading and Wikipedia articles and books that you can go to if you want to encourage that. There will be a question and answer session near the end. In the meantime, we got a couple of lovely helpers who will take your chat questions, and we're going to start working in that direction now. These are the CEU learning objectives, and to a degree they summarize certain big takeaway messages in the talk. We need to become more aware that most of our reactions and reasoning is instinctive. We're born that way. It is part of our genetics, it's part of our culture. In the nature versus nurture debate, one of the big changes in the last 30 years is it's now nature winning over nurture. Who we are is how we're born. And nurture does come into it, but to a far less degree than you learned in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. I'm going to talk about two methods that actually are procedures for discussing ideas that are delicate and difficult with people in an attempt to either understand them better or help them change their perspectives. And we need to recognize that all of this starts with us, that our vulnerabilities are not only what limit us, but they're the keys to our understanding other people. What am I going to talk about? A psychological model. What does that mean? I mean, a lot of people have a lot of ideas, and I'll discuss them in a minute, but what it isn't is what Freud and Jung and Adler and Erickson and all those guys 50 and 100 years ago did, which is write a bunch of words. That's not a psychological model in the modern sense. It's actually invalid. It's what they call anecdotal or descriptive, or if you know the term, qualitative rather than quantitative. The modern theories are quantitative. They are numbers. They are things that you can run through a computer and measure and see how similar or how different people are. We're going to talk about ocean, which many of you have heard of, otherwise known as the Big Five. I'm going to introduce you to the work of Jonathan Haidt and the book, The Righteous Mind, which has as its linchpin something called moral foundations theory. I'm going to review a wonderful book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is very famous, that many people have read. And his late partner, Amos Tversky, was instrumental in his work. They both won the Nobel Prize, if that gives you any idea of what other people think of them. Then I'm going to go into another thing that Jonathan Haidt introduced called social intuitionism, which is a model of the dynamic that goes on between people and their interactions with others. Finally, I'm going to wrap it up by talking about how we actually do talk to other people and how we mostly listen, okay? Even an extrovert like me recognizes that listening is an essential skill. And finally, I'm going to talk about bringing it all back home by improving your personal knowledge. And in there, we'll have a Q&A. Here is my roadmap. There are 4 big theories that I'm going to talk about. And Bonnie, my lovely wife, is going to talk about ocean. She's far more qualified to do that. But I want to point out that the 2 on the top of this page are static models. What does that mean? Well, to quote Lady Gaga, it means born that way. In ocean, once you reach working age, you're baked. The same thing with moral foundations theory. You're baked. That's how you are. And a lot of what we need to understand is people don't have a lot of choices when it comes to what they believe. And changing those beliefs can be very, very difficult. The lower 2 are dynamic models. These are what are called diachronic in the philosophy trade. That means they talk about what happens over time. And so thinking fast and slow is about the reactions and how your mind and your body work together when something happens in your environment, or when you come up with an idea, or when you encounter a person. You've got multiple brains in effect. And then social intuitionism is Jonathan Haidt's model for how it comes together when you interact with other people. And I believe that thinking fast and slow and Jonathan Haidt's social intuitionism are so synonymous, they are so synchronous with each other, that I had to present them both. And they're both wonderful books. Thinking Fast and Slow is a great book. Okay, first I'm going to talk about what is a psychological model. First of all, what is a model? Well, a model in a mathematical sense is something that identifies targets, okay, like people or places or books or music or whatever you're measuring, and a space, right? You can have a space of songs in a rock and roll environment. You can have a space of classical music compositions, or a space of players in a basketball court. And as you can see from the mathematic looking drawing there, if you want to identify where something is in the real world, you've got to give me 3 numbers. Because without 3 numbers, length, width, and height, I can't know where it is. So even in this room, you have to say, well, it's 3 feet from the left wall and 2.5 feet from the front wall and 4 feet off the floor. And now I know where you're talking about. So a good model establishes the degrees of freedom. And that is to say, how many dimensions does the space have? Good models cover the entire space. In other words, there's no places that you can't describe. And good models use dimensions that are independent. I mean, one of the classic problems in measuring socioeconomic statistics is when you measure someone's income and you measure someone's education in the United States, very often the 2 of them are highly correlated with each other. You're not really measuring something different. Good psychological models use dimensional labels that are easily understood and well-defined. And I'll get into that in a minute. Here's an example, and I'll get very quick with this. If you want to meet for coffee, you need to know where, north and south, where, east and west, and when. And the final thing you need to know is what's the elevation. If it's not street level, is it the 3rd sub-basement or the parking garage, or is it the 10th floor? That means there's 4 numbers: north, south, east, west, vertical axis, and time. You've got 4 dimensions. And we're going to talk about ocean. Ocean's a 5-dimensional model, which means it's pretty hard to draw pictures on a flat piece of paper with a 5-dimensional model. And it's nice to have simple labels. Modern psychological models are based on what are called instruments. That is to say, just tests. The good news is it's easy to take tests. The bad news is that tests are self-reporting. It's like the weight loss problem. You ask people what they ate, and they'll tell you that they ate 3 pieces of lettuce and 1 grape, but they put on 2 pounds. So obviously that didn't work, okay? Self-reporting sucks. But unfortunately, in many cases, it's really all you can do. So what good tests do is they have kind of these trick questions where they ask the same idea from the opposite information set. And if you don't answer them consistently, they know that you're effectively covering something up, that you're not clear in your thinking. So they can eliminate deliberate or unconscious manipulation. Good models determine coverage, as to say, everybody can be fit into the space. They determine parameter independence, which means you don't have any wasted data. They evaluate accuracy, which means the same person takes the same test and gets the same result. And then replicability, which means you can measure people over time and you get kind of the same results. Now, at this point, we're going to talk about and introduce the Big Five model. I turn this over to Bonnie, and I'll give her the first slide.
Hi, everyone. I know that, David, I think you're on the wrong slide. Go back one.
Wait, you want this slide?
For just a minute.
Okay.
So many of you attended last month the CEU training, and you've probably already heard about this, but some of you might not have been here, and this is going to be a quicker overview. So several sets of researchers came up with the same 5 factors independently, and they've developed it for decades. So this is going to be the current version. It's mathematically sound, as David was mentioning. It's remarkably universal. Over 50 cultures were studied. And it gives a really rich description of personality. It helps us understand complexities, it shows strengths and weaknesses, and it gives us insights into why we behave the way we do, or why our clients behave the way they do. And it's a thumbnail for quicker access to problem areas and gives you a way to talk to someone about coping with their issues. Next slide, please. So this is an overview slide, visually shows you the ocean model, and it spells ocean. If you go around clockwise, you see the O is for openness to experience, C is for conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and it can be either neuroticism or negative emotionality. And so these 5 broad domains are considered to be the core or essential traits that define human personality and that account for the individual differences. And it's based on how people describe themselves and how they describe others. That's how they developed this. And each represents a range between 2 extremes. And nothing is right or wrong here, or good or bad. There's pluses and minuses depending on where you fall on the continuum. Next slide, please. So here are some correlations and variations that are good to know about. First of all, genetics, and it's even observable through generations where people are genetically similar. And so the Big Five scores are highly correlated with that. And with gender, gender makes a difference. Women come out somewhat higher in several areas, agreeableness and warmth. And warmth is a factor in extroversion. But also they come out a little higher in negative emotionality, and men come out a little higher in assertiveness and openness to ideas. And those are part of the larger categories of extroversion and openness. And culture also affects the Big Five evaluation. It depends a lot on local political systems. Where they value individualism, like our culture, then there are higher average extroversion scores. And if there are power inequalities in a culture, then that results in a little higher average conscientiousness. Birth order makes a difference somewhat. That's still being debated. And it correlates with standard models of psychiatric disorders. It's not a psychiatric diagnostic tool, but using this tool can help give descriptive information that helps illuminate the strengths and weaknesses, and it works well with something like the MMPI. Gives a better context for interpreting the scales of some of those other instruments. Next slide, please. So here are the Big Five traits, or the ocean traits, on different continua. So each one is a continuum. So each person will fall somewhere in the continuum. So it's not a yes or no, you have openness or you don't have it. But on the high side, if you do have it, you would be more inventive, you try new things like food, travel, new theories, you prefer variety, you tackle challenges. And on the low end, you'd be more cautious and more consistent. You would like the tried and true more. For conscientiousness, you'd like to be prepared. On the high side, prepared, finish tasks, handle detail. You like things to be really scheduled. In the extreme, you might be perfectionistic. And on the low side, you would dislike structure. You'd be more carefree. You might choose fun in the moment. You might procrastinate more. And with extroversion, you might be the center of attention, more expressive and share everything, thrive around others, and be more sociable and more high energy. And then on the low end, you would prefer solitude, quieter situation. You'd probably think before you speak. And then you could become more exhausted around other people. With agreeableness, you feel empathy and concern for others, and you really love harmony if you're on the real high side of agreeableness. Enjoy helping others. And so you would be someone who says yes a lot. On the low side, you'd be more uncooperative, more distrustful, more challenging. And then on negative emotionality, in this one, being on the low side is better than being on the high side. Not that there's a good or bad again, but what you're dealing with on the low side, you're more resilient and confident. On the high side, you might be a lot more emotionally reactive, and you could be more dissatisfied with things in life that are going on and have a low tolerance for stress or be anxious. And so remember, these are propensities, not types, but you can use it to develop yourself, and through coaching or therapy, it can be used, it can be very helpful. So next slide, please. Working with a client, here's just an example, 2 examples. If a client is, well, first of all, realize where you're coming from yourself. And I think that's true of each of these models. We can learn how we are, and we can help see where our biases can be when we're working with our clients. But if you're working with someone who has really low conscientiousness, then they would be someone who dislikes structure, schedules, and would procrastinate. So it wouldn't be very helpful for you to give assignments for them to do at home, for example. And if they're high in extroversion, they would get a lot more out of just talking with you and being sociable with you and learning in a session. And another example is if a client is low in agreeableness and maybe having a lot of conflict with a spouse or a friend, you might be able to work with them to see if there's something that they can find to say yes to more often, because it could be that they automatically, because they're lower on agreeableness, just say no to everything. And if you can help them find a few yeses, then they might have a better experience. So before I turn it back over to David, I just want to tell you there are free assessments online that you can take, and we can give you a link to that later. And there's also a video of a longer training about this on our website. Okay, David, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, now we're going to get into the meat of this particular subject, and that is Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. Now, when I say his theory, I mean he and a lot of people have done a lot of analytic work with a lot of tools trying to find out why people believe what they do. Just as Ocean tried to break human personality into these independent dimensions, which are kind of independent of each other. I mean, whether someone is agreeable, for example, I'm very extroverted, but I'm not particularly agreeable. They're independent of each other, okay? In moral foundations theory, it's an attempt to do something similar. And once again, it has, starting off, 5 primary foundations. This is the core of the book, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, which I have in my reading list, and you really ought to go read it, okay? The first one is care, whose opposite is harm. This is cherishing and protecting others. Fairness or proportionality, and I'll talk about the difference there. This means being just in how things are allocated or how people are treated. Loyalty, which means belonging to an in-group, standing with your family, your religion, your political party, your nation. The opposite of betrayal. Authority and respect means you submit to tradition. You submit to what you deem as legitimate authority. Again, it can be religion, it can be police, it can be the military. And then finally, a very important one for today's talk, sanctity or purity. And that is abhorrence for disgusting things, actions. It's the opposite of degradation. So, and we'll talk about what happens when people are high and low in these things in a second. I'm going to go through each of these fairly briefly to keep up with our time constraints. Care really originates in protecting one's own children and family. It's a primary value in liberals in America and pretty much everywhere in the world. And a lot of times you'll hear people worried about the rainforest and worried about the, the gorillas in Africa and worried about, the people in Myanmar. These are liberals almost always. They're people who are very concerned about fairness and care and lack of harm for everyone out there. This even includes animals, right? Now, John Stuart Mill, the famous utilitarian philosopher, English philosopher, said, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised is to prevent harm to others. Now, this is a core belief of a lot of liberals, and I'm one of them in this particular context. Fairness is really interesting. Its primary triggers are acts of cooperation or selfishness. In other words, if someone is seen to actually help and pitch in or be generous with things they have, this stimulates our sociability. It's very much what you see. You see it in chimpanzee groups and monkey groups, in gorilla groups. A lot of interesting stuff happens there. Just like with selfishness. Selfishness causes people to get ostracized amongst our primate relatives. And it's linked to concerns about reciprocity and equality. But notice there's a dichotomy here. There's a kind of a different way of looking at it. Some people think of fairness as equal distribution to all. Others think of fairness, and that's the political left generally. The political right generally thinks of it in terms of proportionality, rewards based on contribution, because you'll find there's a really big thing about the freeloader problem. What do you do with people who don't contribute, who don't bring anything to the table, but they want their share when the goods are being shared? This is a big problem. And how do you view that as fairness or unfairness? Loyalty. Okay. This is a big one because creation of group identities in humans is extremely easy. I mean, I hear it all the time. Like, you don't believe in those guys because they kill dogs and they burn Jesus in effigy. They're trying to demonize others, and it distinguishes team players from traitors. Sports teams do this all the time. They want you to wear the hat and wear the T-shirt and carry the fuzzy plastic bat if it's a baseball team, or go through those stupid ears that guys in what are they called? Truck parties, tailgate parties at football games. And one of the problems that happens in loyalty is demonization of outgroups is the norm. Humans are hardwired to this because 50,000 years ago, as we roamed around the earth and populated basically everything, every little group created a group identity, but they weren't that different. So what did they do? Well, basically the group identity was, this is my group, and that's not. So I love my group, and they're special and they're wonderful. That's why people all over the world, indigenous groups, their word for their tribe is human being. This is the Cheyenne, for example. Their word for their tribe is, we're the human beings and you're not. Okay, humans are hardwired this way. This is how we bred ourselves for a 5 million year period since the Pleistocene to move into the area where we would become human. And you can make the loyalty on religion, socioeconomic identity, language, or anything. People who are members of the AFL-CIO, or people who are the veterans of foreign wars, or the Daughters of the Confederacy. These are very artificial distinctions, yet some people believe in them very much. Authority is a big one. I'm going to have to speed up here a little bit. In authority, you're often involved in a social hierarchy, and where you exist in that hierarchy is indicated by the dress. I mean, churches have Roman collars, and police departments have badges, and military have uniforms with chevrons on the sleeve. And even in a team, you've got people with their names and numbers on the back of their social rules are often grounded in social hierarchies. But the interesting thing about social hierarchies is people really bond to them because there's a dual responsibility. If you're in the police, you expect to be able to have to go out and confront people, but you've got guys watching your back. You've got the thin blue line. They're going to come to your aid. They're going to help you. And your management is going to protect you. Okay, the same thing in the military and in religious groups. So it's a quid pro quo. You're not just giving your freedom and your time and your effort to some organization that doesn't care about you. In fact, they actually do care quite a bit. Sanctity is very important, and this has to do with the obvious opposite of sanctity, which is disgust or degradation. And most cultures have considerations based on purity, which is food. Okay, obviously, Jews don't eat pork, Muslims don't eat pork. We don't eat dog. You start talking about eating dogs, and people get really disgusted right away. And yet they do. They're ending the practice in Asia, but it's been common in Asia for years. It was common all over the North America and South America before Columbus and the Spanish came. There's behaviors that you do and don't do. For example, I never offer my left hand to a Muslim. Okay, I understand the reasons, and I just don't do that. It's not common because typically you shake with your right, but if I have to pass something to a Muslim and I'm aware that person is Muslim, out of respect, I'm going to pass it with my right hand. And then there's treatment for the dead. Everybody wants to have a different role for how the dead is treated. And this often dovetails with loyalty, because the common thing that happens, and I'll talk about this again, is that people who want to create a political or a religious group or cult or segregated area want to tell you that you're among the chosen, and those guys over there, they're impure. They bring corruption. They will corrupt our way of life. This is the common rant of the person who wants you to join his or her group and believe in what they do, because the big manipulation they've got to do is they've got to convince you that others are unclean. This can even extend to things like flags, clothing, books, principles, things that you espouse. And then, of course, there's sex and contraception and beliefs about conception. And many of these trigger the sanctity. I want to say one little thing you might not believe, but it's true. They can hook people up to what are effectively lie detectors and show them pictures, and they can tell whether you're a liberal or a conservative. And there are people who are working on blood tests to be able to determine if people are genetically predisposed to being conservative versus liberal. I could get into the details, but you can look it up in the research. It's all there. Now, the Moods and Feelings Questionnaire is a standard instrument for measuring depressive symptoms. And what this shows, and I'm not going to get into it in any great detail, what it shows is, if you look at the bottom of the square, you see liberal, very liberal, liberal, slightly, all the way down to very conservative. And then you can see how people score on these 5 fundamental dimensions of the moral foundations theory. And you can see that if you can measure the results of the Moods and Feelings Questionnaire and interpret it through the gaze of moral foundations, you can predict people's political beliefs, right? And these are consistent through life from the attainment of working age. When Jonathan Haidt and his people at the group called yourmorals.org, which is an NGO, began looking at this and trying to analyze political belief systems, they found that they really needed to add one more dimension or foundation, which is called liberty oppression. And it identifies concerns about political equality and a grave dislike of repression. And again, it's related to fairness, but it's not exactly the same thing. So now I'm going to get to the heart of the thing. Here is what is known as the liberal moral matrix. At the top, you have the big rectangle that says, what are we looking at? The most sacred value for most liberals is care for victims of oppression. At the bottom, you see the 6 pillars, the 6 foundations. And you can see that care is a really big deal. That's what the big, thick black line means. You can see that liberty is big. Fairness is important, but the others, not so much, okay? This is your classic liberal matrix. The next one, and I'm moving on here fairly quickly, is the social conservative moral matrix. Most sacred value, preserve the institutions and traditions that sustain their view of a moral community. Now, notice something interesting. There are 6 pillars here, but they're all fairly balanced. Why is that? In my view, and the literature supports this, the social conservatives tend to be more like many people in the rest of the world and many people throughout human history. One of my messages to liberals is, you are new people. You are different. You are not the people we read about in the history books 500 years ago. You're not the people we read about who live in Pakistan or Indonesia, okay, or New Guinea. You are a different sort of creature. And that social conservatives, there's nothing wrong with being a social conservative. In fact, if you look at social conservatives' beliefs, they tend to be more balanced across the board in terms of these high and most important foundations. Okay, Bonnie's going to talk now for a minute about trying to use some of this in a contextual client setting.
All right, this is working with a client and using some of the moral foundations information like what David was talking about. If we have a client that has a conflict about re-entering the social world during the pandemic, the client may be afraid to do that, and friends and associates are ready to do that sooner than the client is ready. So one way you could work with this person is, first of all, to explore their own foundations and understand themselves better to see, is it the care harm foundation, most likely the cherishing and protecting others, the opposite of doing harm, that they're paying attention to? Well, you can explore that and see if is what they believe and what they're deciding is correct information for now, because it's changing every day, it's changing every week. And even if it's correct and it probably, adheres to what's happening locally, it could be that they could find a way to, in the future, to plan for the future for when they could possibly return. And understanding the other person is an important part of it too, exploring the client's perceptions of others' foundations. Maybe the others are paying more attention to loyalty to the group and really wanting to get together. So if they can acknowledge with each other that they both want to see each other, they've lost something. They've lost the ability to get together. But what they can do is talk this through, understand the reasoning, and maybe role play some conversations. For example, they might need to pay attention and say, I know you miss getting together, and so do I. How could we do something that's more limited? How could we do something that fits in with my beliefs so that I can still feel safe? And then maybe in the future, we'll be able to adjust that as we go. So it's the idea of coming up with a plan together so you have something to look forward to. So now I'm going back to David.
Okay, now we're going to get into the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Kahneman published the book, I think, after Tversky died, but what they did was they invented a whole field called behavioral economics, which is now a big deal everywhere in the world. And if you've read about what's happening on the stock market with GameStop and Robinhood and all that, it's not about logic and reason, it's about human behavior. And that's what they talked about, is trying to figure out why people do what they do. And the core of the book talks about two modes of thought and two selves. System one is instinctive, emotional, quick, and very hard to suppress when you get that reaction. System two is a more rational one. And the example I use here is you're walking in the woods and you come around a corner and there's a bear. Well, your instinctual attitude is run like hell. And you start to feel your blood pulse, your body gets hot, your throat gets dry, your blood pressure goes up, you're panting because you're preparing to run. But then system two kicks a little and says, wait a minute, I saw a thing on the Discovery Channel about how when I'm confronted with a bear, what I should do is make no noise, don't look at him directly, and walk slowly away from the bear backwards until I get into a safe distance, because I can't run because he'll catch me. This is how we all are in this world. And a lot of the problems in the modern world have to do with the fact that people run around operating on system one when the world is way more complicated than woods and bears. It's not a Paleolithic world anymore. It's not even a Neolithic world. It's a technocratic world. And we need to think about what we're doing. And then there are the two selves, the experiencing self, the here and now, reactive, verbal, emotional, decision-making self, and then the remembering self, the one that looks back in the past over what was done and what was decided and tries to figure out whether that was the right thing to do or not. Now, I was going to go into these in detail, but they get quite complicated and I really can't do it. What these are, and one of the things that happens in the book Thinking Fast and Slow and in several other books in the reading list, is a long digression on how human rational powers are not what they're cracked up to be. Humans are not good reasoners. They are biased by information that they don't understand. They can be skewed in their beliefs by the way things are phrased or what context they're put in. They're always looking to substitute a simpler problem for a hard one. That's so common all the time. Everybody wants to break it down to something simple they can understand, when many of the time they can't understand it at all. And they just simply have to recognize they need help. Okay. Then there's also sunk cost, which is the idea that people are emotionally committed to what the money they've already spent, even though if that money's been wasted, they might as well give it up. This is a gamble. It's a thing in gambling called gambler's ruin. Now, I've got some stuff in the reading list about this. What it boils down to is people do not handle probabilities at all well. They don't factor randomness at all well. They cannot get over selection bias, which is where they look for information that confirms what they believe in already, also known as confirmation bias. We are very, very bad reasoners, and this is why we have to work on practicing our logic and our reason and look on our sources. We just don't do this anywhere nearly as well. Most of us live in a delusion that we're far better at this stuff than we think we are. I'm ending this very brief coverage of Thinking Fast and Slow with one of my favorite quotes from Oscar Levant, who was a piano player and actor back in the 50s and 40s. He said, happiness isn't something you experience, it's something you remember. In other words, system 1 doesn't know happy. System 2 is where you recognize happy. And one of the great findings of modern cognitive theory, brain theory, is that we constantly rewrite our personal histories. And the reason for that is cognitive science has shown us that the act of remembering and the act of recall are the same thing biochemically. When you recall something, you actually rewrite that information in your brain. You actually edit it and rebuild it. So you can look back on things, and the things you didn't like that might have happened, you elide them. You actually leave them on the cutting room floor. And the things that you enjoyed, you exaggerate. So you are literally rewriting your memories. In other words, humans not only don't reason well, we don't even remember very reliably. And this has been proven over and over again. If you look at the changes in the legal system, when we were young, the best evidence you could have was a witness. Now, the least reliable evidence in modern judicial proceedings is an eyewitness. They're terrible. And they've been proven to be terrible for 40 years. And it's only now, after many, many years, and all the Justice Innocence projects proving that all these guys are on death row for no reason, has it been shown that eyewitnesses are just atrocious. Now, I'm sorry, Bonnie, I jumped your slide there, so I'm leaving it over to you.
Okay. So working with the client under Thinking Fast and Slow, I'd like to use an example from our TLC Way to Go group. We use cognitive behavioral therapy, and what we do is examine the client's standard decision process. So if someone thinks, for example, I had a stressful day and food will comfort me, that's kind of thinking fast in the here and now. I think I'm going to go have some food and that's going to make me feel better. So we have them stop and think more slowly and say, is this true? And if it's true, is it true that it's going to comfort me? And if it is true, is it helpful? If it's not helpful to my weight loss plan, then maybe there's another thing I can do. So what we do is re-examine and use a counter that's very personalized to the person, to the individual, and help them figure out what they can say. And for some, it's just a matter of saying, stop. I can find another way to comfort myself that doesn't sabotage my diet. So it's thinking slower, reflecting, evaluating, and paying attention to your own instinctual beliefs and patterns, but countering it with more reasonable thoughts to support your goals. So the takeaway really is we can encourage clients to be patient during decision making and to revisit their decisions regularly based on new information and experience. And we can do that with ourselves too. Okay, David, back to you.
Okay, we're moving into the second dynamic model. Now, Thinking Fast and Slow, again, was a dynamic model. Moral foundations and ocean are static models. You're born that way, basically, or by the time you're 18, you're just that way. Social intuitionism has to do with interaction with things and with other people. And here's one of the big takeaways. The metaphor of the elephant and the rider. The elephant is the automatic, emotional, instinctual, visceral brain. It's the bulk of our brain. It's from the medulla oblongata up here to the frontal cortex. The rider is the prefrontal cortex. It's way up here. It's the conscious, verbal, thinking brain where all that information is integrated. The elephant is the impulsive mind, and the rider is the rational mind. And the path is whatever you happen to run across in your life. And what you need to do, what he means by willpower is the strength of the rider, is exactly what Bonnie was talking about. He means that you can hold off on letting the elephant run wild. It isn't just that the rider's small, the rider's in a control position. Now, it may not always be able to control the elephant, but it's in a good position to be able to bring that huge body of knowledge and information and millions of years old reaction to threats and opportunities and hunger and desire for sex and all those things that are going on, and bring it into a rational framework that can live within a society and bring you happiness. Viewing the elephant's role. In effect, this entire slide says, not only do intuitions come first, but subsequent reasoning are really just post hoc justifications for what we do. So we react, we see something, we react intuitively, we behave, and then the rational is part of it that supposedly is our glory as a human being, is really all about explaining to ourselves why what we did was wonderful, or to anybody else who will listen why what we did was wonderful. Okay, this is really what's been shown over and over again, that in effect, most of what we think of as calm, deliberative rationalization is about making ourselves legends in our own minds. Okay, making ourselves seem very, very important. Now, the moral reasoning process is biased because people want to seem coherent in their own life histories. They don't want to say, well, the same thing happened 2 weeks ago, but I did something totally different. Why did I do that? No, you have to find a reason why what you did 2 weeks ago and what you did yesterday were really right. You were really on target. You're special. Look in the mirror to give yourself a big high five. Okay, that's what we all want to do. Then the post hoc justifications often need to distort the nature of the interaction so that you come out smelling like a rose. This is the big chart here. On the left, you have I put a subtitle, elephants are bigger and have their feet on the ground. There's a triggering event. The elephant reacts to it. That's A's intuition. A judgment is created. I should tell this person to go away, or I should buy one of those, or I should eat that hamburger, or I should get back in my car because it's raining. That's the judgment. And then there's the reasoning part of it, okay? And if you look, there's big black arrows from the triggering event through the intuition, judgment, and reasoning. But then there's dashed arrows that go back. And this is what I want to emphasize here, is that you have reasoned judgment and private reflection. In other words, later when it's calm, you can sit down and you can think, here's what happened. Why did I do that? What should I have done instead? And then you can update your belief, your behavior based on what happened. A lot of people believe, well, I'm just that way. That's how I am. I always do that. I always get afraid in these situations, or I always get overly excited when that happens. Well, the fact is, you're an adult. You can change that. But how do you change it? You don't change it by looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, I will never, have a second drink at dinner again, or I will never eat a dessert. No, you have to sit down and understand why this is important to you and what you can do about it. You have to use reasoning and an understanding of yourself to go back and update your intuitions and judgments based on new information. Now I want to talk a little bit about why things get really different. We here in the West, that is to say, European-derived cultures in the main, that's North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, all of Europe, all that stuff. There's a new acronym that's floating around that's really, really important, and you'll read about it all the time, and it's called WEIRD, and it stands for Western, Educated, Rich, and Democratic. And here I don't mean Democrats, I mean just they're in political systems where voting is the core of the political system. Remember that most of what everybody learned about psychology and social work and stuff was based on studies on 5% or less of the human population. Mostly they were young college-educated kids, many of whom were male, and it was in these weird countries. This is not a good sample. From the standpoint of science, this is a terrible sample. Granted, when some PhD in 1950 wanted to figure out what happened when you wanted to encourage people to shock other people, like Stanley Milgram did, he reached out and he took his grad students and they went out and they put an ad in the school paper and they got a bunch of kids in there and figured it out. That was cheap. That was easy. We need to move past that. So we need to look more at what are we learning here. We need to understand that we, as members of the Western liberal tradition, and again, I don't mean liberal politically, I mean liberal in the sense that we are of modern belief. We don't live in a theocratic society where we believe that God is the origin of all things. Okay, now maybe you do, but our society as a whole, that's not a shared belief. The liberal tradition is much freer. It's built around the idea of freedom and justice and a lot of things that don't pertain to many of the societies historically and in the world today. We need to recognize, those of us who do aspire to being in the Western liberal tradition, that it is implicitly anti-religious and anti-sectarian. In other words, the more you believe in modern philosophy, the less you believe that any one group, whether it's religion or politics, has all the answers. The more you believe that you should look more widely, you should read more history and read more science and get in more opinions to see what's been discovered. And by anti-religious, I don't mean they're saying there is no God. What they're saying is the range for God's behavior in the world has gotten smaller. And the big example there is creationism. I believe in evolution. I believe in the Big Bang. Do I believe there's no God? Well, that's another question. I understand that people can well believe in God and believe in the Big Bang and evolution. There isn't no intrinsic dichotomy there. There's no intrinsic opposition. People can believe both in evolution and in God. What they don't believe in is that God created every little species specifically. That's natural selection. And so the arena in which religion is applicable got smaller as we got into the liberal tradition. So we need to remember where we're coming from, particularly when we try to talk to people in the rest of the world. If you were to talk to a Pakistani or someone from South India or someone from Indonesia, you would find that many of the things that you accept as norms in your world simply aren't. Well, the origins of intuition. Now I'm talking now not about nature or genetics. I'm talking about nurture. That is to say, people are acculturated from the time that they're born until they leave home or go out into the world. What are they trained in? Well, by and large, you inherit your culture's viewpoint. Most societies in the world have chosen to be sociocentric. They place the needs of groups and institutions first. And this, of course, is predominantly what you see in China and Korea and Japan and Manchuria and a lot of India, Pakistan. Individualistic societies place individuals in the center of everything and leave things up to the individual. We are the quintessential individualized country in the world. And there's a social consensus that it looks, the rest of the world values social consensus or sociocentric models far more than individual freedoms. And you can see this because they believe peace, harmony, and ancient traditional systems are far more important than making sure that no one is ever put in jail for a crime he or she didn't commit. A lot of places don't care much about that. And moral learning, and this is the whole point here, is I want to encourage each of us to become a moral learner. And I want us to figure out ways where we can help other people become moral learners. Moral learning starts with role taking, putting yourself in someone else's shoes and looking at the problem from that perspective. Now, I've been talking a lot about emotions, and I want to make sure you know that emotions are not bad. They're actually essential. Emotions cause us to want to live. We want to live. We want to be happy. We want others to be happy. We want to get it. Emotions are not dumb or static. We're wired for our emotions to improve over time. Our emotions and our intuitions can learn. And there's two different kinds of cognition, intuition and reasoning. And they can feed each other, you know. If you go into your kitchen and you find that after the burner's been on, this part of the stove is always hot, even though it doesn't say it's hot, then that's reasoned learning. That's not an intuition. You had to learn that by putting your finger on there and getting it burned, but now you know, and it's fed your reasoning. Just like your reason can teach you about your intuition. And you can backfeed things that you've deduced or learned into your reactions to things. And the bottom line here is, if you want to change people's minds, you've got to talk to their elephants. You have to be aware. If there's nothing else you remember about this whole talk, it's people believe what they believe almost because they have to. They have very little choice in the matter. That's how they are. They're born that way. And if you want to work with them, you've got to show them your elephant, and your elephant has to talk to their elephant. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Bonnie.
And that was a great lead in for this example of working with a client under social intuitionism. So my example here is you have a client who wants to remodel her kitchen and her spouse is opposed to it. Well, she's actually living in her elephant and being really emotional about it. She's, I really want it to happen. It has to happen. We've set the money aside. Anyway, I'm intuitive and my spouse just doesn't honor what's going on with me. So she comes to you as a therapist and tells you this. And so what he's living more though within his writer head, and he's being really matter of fact, and he's saying it's going to cost twice as much, it's going to take 3 times as long. And so he's not acknowledging her emotions and she's not acknowledging his reasoning. So I think it might be helpful in therapy to help her think through her own reasonings and judgment and practice a conversation where she could use some factual information that she would gather and also acknowledge that he might have some other things going on in his elephant self where perhaps he's afraid that the money is going to be way too much or that they're going to be inconvenienced for way too long. And there could be some things that she's not acknowledging with him. So perhaps you could role play the conversation before she talks again with her spouse, and perhaps she could end up appealing to his emotional side and expressing her logical side so that they could come to a meeting of the minds.
Thank you, Bonnie.
David, back to you.
Okay. I love quotes like this. Mark Twain said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth for all of one's lifetime." A lot of people who haven't traveled around the world, and I don't mean just, all the continents, but I mean even a few other countries, learned another language, studied another culture, they really believe that what they're doing is God's plan. And when they go somewhere else and everything is the other way around and the food is all spicy and the language is full of things that make you spit and they treat different animals differently than we do, recognize that these things are not there to confuse you. They're learning opportunities. I learned a lot when I was a kid, but I won't bore you with that. Now, here's the final capstone of the talk, talking with others. How do we do this? First, we have to recognize, and I'm summarizing again here, how to overcome big human limitations. First and foremost, it has been proven many times, and there's an article in my reading list about this, clear evidence that when you beat people up with facts, even if you're absolutely right, all you do is harden up their opinion of what they've already have, because they get into shame mode, they get into fear mode, that commutes into anger, and the next thing you know, they're donating more money to their party. Okay, or they're watching more of their echo chamber news program. In other words, you can't beat on people with facts. It doesn't work. There's clear evidence that genetics is hugely important. Clear evidence that your culture is hugely important. In fact, the famous question, is it nature or nurture? The modern answer is yes, it is. Okay, I could get into more detail about that. It's complicated, but I want to go on here. Opportunities. Okay, start with you. First and foremost, listen. That's a skill. Active listening, feedback, whatever it is. Use open questions. Don't say, why do you, don't you think that politician X is a complete jerk? That's a leading question. It's not even a real question. What you say is, what has he done that you really liked about him? There's a good question. Maybe you'll learn something. Recognize that we're all being manipulated. I don't care if you're on the left, right, or in the middle, or from Mars. Somebody's trying to sell you some snake oil, and somebody's trying to sell you some milk. And it's your job to figure out milk from snake oil, and it's not anybody else's job. Be ready to learn. Don't expect to convince. In other words, I'm talking humility. You can't just go in there and say, I'm going to tell that person that everything they know is crap. Well, you know, you're not going to get anywhere like that. And remember, it's mostly about emotion. You're talking to elephants. The reasoning part is very small. And then you've got to notice your own limitations, your own echo chamber. Now, here are two models for how to conduct these kinds of interviews with people that have been very recently developed. One is called MINT. It stands for Motivational Interviewing, and it's helping others explore their process. And I'm going to summarize here by saying you ask open questions, you listen carefully, and you try to hold a mirror up to someone's thought process. You know, where did you find that out? What did you do? How did you feel about that? You know, a lot of those kinds of open-ended, semi-therapeutic questions to get people to recognize that many times their information is tenuous or non-existent. Just something they saw on Facebook that their cousin posted when he was drunk. You know, they don't know any better. And if you show them up, you can understand that. It's similar to talk therapy models where even though a lot of times the therapist gets the idea within about 20 minutes that this guy's got a problem with his mother, you don't want to say, you got a problem with your mother, give me $150 and go away, right? That's not what you do. You sit and say, tell me about your family. And then you figure out, maybe you're on the wrong track, maybe you're on the right track, but he's got to work at it. MINT seems to have an effective rate of roughly 10%, which, by the way, isn't bad in this kind of thing. And a lot of therapeutic processes, a solid 10% is not that bad. Most of us think, many people think that talk therapy is really super effective. Well, I got a clue for you. It ain't. Okay, it works in certain cases with certain people. Another one of these ways of doing this is called moral reframing, and this is a method for talking to elephants. I've got the names of the fellows who are the PhDs who are investigating this at the bottom of this slide. And what it is you alter the structure of an argument to appeal to foundational core values. The example is pollution. Most liberal arguments say, oh, it's harming the environment, people are going to get sick, you know, animals are going to have problems, kids are going to get asthma. It appeals to care harm. To appeal to conservatives, you would reframe it by talking about you need clean water to be healthy. It prevents disease. It prevents contamination in food. It prevents contamination in the soil. This appeals to the sanctity foundation. I'm not talking about making stuff up. I'm talking about recognizing that when most of us frame our arguments, we take the same sets of facts and spin them according to our moral foundations. And what I'm saying is we should work with them to frame them in a more value neutral thing that brings in all of the moral foundations. So people could look at them and say, well, there is another way to look at this, I guess, you know. I would talk about climate change here, but I'm running out of time. Okay. Now I'm getting toward the end, and I'm talking about how do you become a better reasoner? How do you improve your access to information, your incorporation of information, your retraining your elephant, reworking with your emotions? First and foremost, you need reliable sources. And I'll give you a clue right now. They're not on television, okay? And they're not on Facebook. You need to look up academic journals. You need to find quality magazines and stuff, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And you need to find information that you can trace back to actually where it came from. Who released that data? Where did it come from? Because by the time most of the information in the news media today is put there, it has either had the chance to be contaminated by political viewpoints, or it's nothing but someone's political viewpoint, okay? And you also have to learn the basics of data analysis. You have to know what base rate is. One of the big things that shocks me is I talk to people all the time about stuff like, you know, the prevalence of COVID or HIV or childhood asthma or breast cancer. And I say, well, what's the base rate? And they look at me like I just grew a green eye in the middle of my forehead, right? I didn't grow a green eye. Base rate is the single most important thing that you ever ask when they talk about something happening. What is the base rate? It means the background occurrence of that in the population. So if somebody says it's going to make you twice as vulnerable to disease X, well, if disease X has a base rate of 30%, that's really terrible. You know, you don't want that at all. But if disease X has a base rate of 1 in a million, twice the risk, 2 in a million, no change. Don't worry about it. Okay. You need to know that. Probability distributions, mean, median, standard deviation. Learn what basic testing methodology really means. What is a random sample? Was the test a random sample, or was it just some stupid phone poll, which almost never is a random sample? Now you have to turn that light of intelligence on yourself. Examine your own personal framing. What do you bring to the party? And then one of my favorites is find and read opposing positions. Hold your nose and read what the other guys are saying. Because if you just read what people around you are saying, or what you already believe, you've wasted your time. Why would you read things that you already believe in, that you already know? That's just feel good stuff. It's like taking a warm shower, right? The hard stuff is going out and actually researching that well-positioned opposing positions. I don't mean watch Fox News or watch MSNBC. I'm talking about find out who these people are. A lot of the politicians that we either love or hate put out white papers. They put out policy papers, which are well-reasoned documents. Find their white papers on their website. Read what they really have to say. And when you're talking, start by assuming that those who differ with you aren't just idiots. They may have very well-reasoned positions. Improve your intuition with experience. And then one of my other big hot buttons, and a lot of the reason for the talk today, update your information. Much of that was standard knowledge 20 and 30 years ago, as I said earlier, is not just out of date, it's flat wrong. One of the big ones is nature nurture. Back in the 70s, 80s, there was one woman famously who said, the only difference between men and women is that women like men and men like women. Well, I'll tell you what, a whole lot of science has come and gone that says that she was as wrong as any speaker who uttered words in the history of the English language. And the only way to update the information is to choose to do so. Be suspicious of information sources that talk about animals and cockroaches and untouchables and unreliables and not sharing our values. And my example here, Ann Coulter wrote a book that said, How to Talk to a Liberal If You Have to. Well, it starts out with the title page saying, I'm going to teach you how to be prejudiced. Read me and become even more firmly convinced of Ann Coulter's worldview. Be suspicious of information sources that don't tell you where they got their data, that don't reference journal articles or white papers or published government documents or business press releases, things that don't point to websites or encyclopedias. And be suspicious of information that try to tell you how you should think. Give me the data and keep your beliefs to yourself. Let me figure it out. And any information sources that challenge well-researched information, anti-evolution sources, anti-vaxxers, anti-science, creationism. What's really strange is you find that a lot of the same people who believe in Bigfoot don't believe in vaccines. That's no accident. These are people who are high in neuroticism, who don't trust others, who lack agreeableness, who are simply pulling things out of the woodwork to create a worldview that supports them as being the only person who's intelligent and right in the room. And when you see these things, recognize that these beliefs, however you may feel, these are not just minority opinions. It's 1 in 1,000 scientists who doesn't believe in vaccine, okay? Then beware of when people are manipulating you, like information sources that are clearly trying to get you to trigger your disgust reflex or trigger your care harm reflex. And one of the ones that bugs me, have you seen those commercials for the ASPCA where they have all those sick dogs? Well, they're trying to get me to trigger my harm. Now, you can show me 3 pictures of sick dogs, but if you put up a 4-minute commercial with 500 sick dogs, I'm never going to give you a dime because I know what you're doing. You're trying to talk to my elephant. Now, beware of beware of information sources that tell you not to investigate information. I've heard a lot of times they'll say, well, if you go look at their website, they'll tell you all the stuff that isn't true. Well, how else are you supposed to find it out? Are you supposed to believe everything you're told? No, you go look at it. Here are some ideas, and this comes from Jonathan Haidt's second book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And the 3 ideas are really bad, and they have to do with what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. In other words, you need to fear challenges. You got to stay away from ideas you don't like and don't understand. You got to be very afraid. This is happening on the left and on the right. And as a lefty, basically, I really detest it on the left because it's against every principle we believe in. You don't fear challenges. You go do research and accept them. Trigger warnings? No trigger warnings. Okay. Always trust your feelings. No, your feelings are genetic. Your feelings are cultural. 70 to 80% of your feelings, you don't have any choice over. They're not based on anything real. They're based on things that evolved in the Pleistocene forest, in the African savanna 4 million years ago. Those don't apply anymore. They're not valid. Okay. And the biggie, that life is a battle between good people and evil people. The message is distrust or cancel those who disagree, right? The right is always talking about how much they hate the left's cancel culture, but they do all the canceling too. Everybody's wanting to cancel everybody. My belief is the truly evil people are the ones who encourage this dichotomous good-evil thinking. In philosophy, it's known as Manichaean thinking. Mani was an ancient Persian prophet who, like Zoroastrianism, taught a dualistic cosmology, where the world was divided, the universe was divided between a good spiritual world of light and an evil material world of darkness. The fact is, this is how we're wired. This is just the philosophy that we are wired to have. It's really easy to trigger that we're the human beings and they're not. We're the great guys and they're the animals. We're the good guys. They're the cockroaches. This is absolutely the worst thing. And anyone who says this kind of stuff, for whatever reason, should be shunned. Those are the people I cancel because they don't they're trying to manipulate and control you. Now, I'm going to skip this for now, and I'm going to go into what is one of my favorite examples as a middle of the roader, and that is abortion. To some people, it's simply murder. I grew up in the Catholic Church. It's simply murder. To others, it is an essential human right to be able to control who gets and who doesn't get an abortion. And the right will talk about the preservation and sanctity of human life. The left will talk about the slippery slope. My attitude has always been, why don't we limit the number of abortions to the smallest possible number? Why don't we bring that down? And on the right, it would be encouraging people to accept the fact that they're pregnant, to have an easy way for them to give up children, to have a good adoption system where the children who were born to people who did not want to have children could have a good home to go to, maybe eliminate the need for a lot of IVF, maybe help people have families who want families and can't have them themselves. And on the left, the idea that somewhere along the way, it really is a human being and you really don't want to allow abortions to happen too late during gestation. And you want to find a way to find that happy medium. And my view is there should be a way that the left and the right can work together to bring the number down as small as possible. But when I bring this up to people on the left and right, I generally get flack. The lefties say it's a slippery slope, abortion on demand. The righties say it's a human being from the moment of conception. And I go away thinking, something's wrong here. We just can't be this absolutist about these things because it simply isn't as black and white as all that. And as I say at the end of the slide, is there common ground? Okay, I'm done with the bulk of my talk. Those were the models that you were introduced to, along with my own spin on how we need to be able to talk more intelligently to others and bring them into our fold rather than trying to push our ideas down their throats. Takeaway messages. Human beliefs are ingrained, genetic or cultural. They're there. As Lady Gaga said, born that way. Modern psychological theories now exist that try to mathematicize modern philosophy, modern psychology. And they're trying to turn psychology into a true science, which in my belief, it never has been. It's beginning to look that way. Many of the most famous things in psychology turn out in the light of day to simply be not reproducible. And you can look into this. There's a reproducibility crisis in psychology because it simply was not a science. They didn't understand the null hypothesis or the scientific method. And we need to work to bring that out. Now there are some valid methods. There's ocean, there's moral foundations, there's several others that I could talk about. But we need to come into the modern world of mathematicization. That is to say, being quantitative as well as qualitative. And we need finally to have an integrated theory of human personality, behavior, and interaction. I'm trying in my own small way to encourage whoever has a connection to anybody to say all of these things could be integrated into something more sophisticated, but they're not. Okay, I need to take a deep breath. And at this point, we're going to unmute people.
So I just pressed the ask all to unmute. So we'd like to open it up to questions. What questions do you have? What comments do you have? And just raise your hand, please.
For those of you who don't have your video on, you can use the chat feature to let us know that you have a question.
I just want to say it's an excellent presentation, and I agree with most of what you said, David. So I just had a conversation with someone earlier today, which kind of demonstrates the far right and the far left opinions clashing. So it was very helpful to hear what you had to say.
Well, thank you. I do have a few more slides. If we don't have a lot of questions, I'll just go ahead and dive into them. Yes,
There's one
Karen?
from Karen.
I'm particularly interested in your reading list, so I can't wait to see that.
Okay, well, it's coming up.
But this may be a crazy question, but where does love fit in?
Well, that's not a crazy question. In this model, it's the elephant. It's in the elephant.
Okay.
In other words, there's a lot of one of my big deals is the study of ancient life and ancient human beings and cultural evolution and ancient DNA and how we got to where we are. And it's very obvious that we pair bonded a long time ago and created life bonds that are different from chimpanzees and different from bonobos and different from gorillas. But these were enhancements or growth in areas that had been around a long time. Animals had social groups, but our social milieu is the thing that really differentiated us from our predecessors on the planet. And there, that notion of love comes under care harm. It comes under closing that circle and protecting the family. It's instinctual. It's associated very closely with sex. And the reality is that no one has a really good model of how love per se fits in there. Another one that's missing is happiness. Where's happiness in all this stuff? I would love to be able to add on those things, but there's several viable theories of happiness, several theories of love. But the biggest one really says that love in human society is the primary glue or support structure for our small cultural village. Do you know what Dunbar's number is? Okay.
No.
Dunbar is an English anthropologist, and what he did was he began looking all over the world, both historically and more modern, more recently, to find out what's the natural size of a human population. Well, Dunbar's number, by the way, is 75, and 75 turns out to be the number of people that most people can remember, not just the names of, but whose kid they are and whose uncle they are and who's, where'd they come from and are they good at hunting deer and, do they know how to make a good pair of pants? All that people stuff, because when it gets bigger, you don't have that anymore. So effectively, love is an intuition, an instinct. It's part of the elephant, but it extends out to the family and from there into the group, because if you look back at human life, there never really was a nuclear family. That's false. There was always a group. There was always a tribe, a herd, some number of people, because you can't survive as a family. The minimum, they've done mathematical studies all over, you needed something like 40 to 70 people to form a breeding population that could go somewhere else and wouldn't just die of either disease or animal predation or old age. If you want to have a continuing population, you always had to have a tribe. Okay. And it was the love that kept that concentric circle of rings where it's you and your mate, it's you and your mate and your children, it's you and your mate and your children and your in-laws, it's you and your mate and your children and the guy who killed the last buffalo, and it grows out from there. So my view is it's part of that, but I don't look at love with a capital L. I look at love as an element of the sociological glue that makes human society work. Any more? I'll go on.
Wait just a minute.
I'm seeing a lot of names and not faces.
Yeah.
David, could you give us another example of the intuition and the reaction and going back to adding?
Okay. Another example is imagine that you're over at one of the town squares and you look over and you glance out of the corner of your eye and you see a guy kick a dog right in the ribs hard, and the dog yelps and he's fleeing away or whatever. Your first reaction is, that SOB just kicked the dog. But then as you look at the scene and you realize there's a little girl who's hiding behind her mother's legs, holding onto him for dear life. And it dawns on you that you heard a snap, and you recognize that maybe that dog tried to bite that little girl. And the guy who kicked the dog was merely trying to protect the child. And so before you overreact, before you get into the situation, you need to bring that reason to bear. And police do this all the time. They go into a situation where there's a loud party, right? And you hear all this raucous stuff. I'll give you another really good example. We used to live in the British Virgin Islands. And my wife, Bonnie, came to me one day and said, you know those guys who were doing the new roof on the house next door? She said they're all fighting with each other. I thought, they're fighting on a roof? They're all going to fall off and die. So I went outside and I realized they were a bunch of islanders, right? There's a term they call down islanders, people who are not from the island of Tortola. Most of the workmen were from all over the Caribbean. And those guys are loud and they're raucous and they're funny and they kid each other, and they do that guy thing of kind of getting up at each other's faces and saying, oh, you guy, my sister wouldn't go out with you on a wet day, kind of thing. And they made a lot of noise. And I walked over there and realized they were having the time of their lives while they were working. And it sounded to the American ear like a fight. Mm-hmm. And yet when I got over there and I listened to the intonations and I knew the island argot a little bit better than my wife, and I watched their faces and I could see their body language, and they're hammering shingles on the top of the roof while they're talking like they're going to kill somebody. That's just their sociological style, and you have to go along with that. So your instincts and your intuition, the examples I've given are fairly small, but you can come to grips with more longer ones, but I don't have time to get into the bigger ones. All I can do is tell you that you know much more quickly that you're in the grip of an intuition, of an instinct, when you feel your heart race, when you feel your breath catch, when you feel your eyes go open, when you feel your body move back. And ask yourself, why did I do that? What was that about? And because the failure to reason, your failures of reason are not really that easy to spot. That takes a lot more time and trouble. But your mistaken instincts are much easier to grasp and notice.
Thank you, David.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go on with the next few slides. What do we do now? Well, this is a long slide that basically says that people have been trying to integrate things like psychology, belief, behavior, and love and happiness and all these things for a long time. And almost all of it has been not just qualitative, it's actually been anecdotal. I mean, Freud was a great guy, but he was just Freud. He's one guy sitting in the office, smoking his cigars, doing his cocaine. And, that's how he got into it, right? Because he was addicted to cocaine and he had to go get help to try to stop being a cocaine abuser. But he was in a particular society, came up with a theory. And as somebody put it to me in the 70s, they said, yeah, Freud's theory is really great if you happen to be a Jew in Vienna, a wealthy Jew in Vienna in 1890. that's what you are, then by God, you should read Freud. But beyond that, Freud really, don't Freud. The superego id stuff. It's like, that's like the medieval church. Great music, bad theology. So what I'm saying is we need to take all of this stuff, ocean, moral foundations theory, thinking fast and slow, and integrate it into models that we can use in real time with people. And that's what I think we need to do. I need to do as an information scientist, and psychologists and social workers and anthropologists need to work together to figure out what in the hell human beings really are. Quotes to remember. For every complex problem, there's an answer that's clear, simple, and wrong. I think of this every time I watch the news, particularly, I must say, when I watch conservative news, but I see oversimplification as a chronic problem. It's like hives. They can't seem to get away from oversimplification. Then make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. That's Einstein, right? And this is another biggie, right? People want to take a problem like global warming or abortion or minimum wage, and they want to try to say, oh, well, obviously it's X. Well, no, it's not obvious. If we're obvious, we would have fixed it already, So it's clear that when we thought about things, I like that, fought and thought about things for years and still haven't come to a solution, it's obviously complicated. It ain't simple. I don't care what people say. And then one of the gods of physics, the wonderful Richard Feynman, said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And this is where you come down to confirmation bias. Most people look for ways to confirm their life, their family, their upbringing, their religion, their political party, the color of their clothing, the color of their hair. And the fact is that we need to stop selecting on those bases. We need to broaden the horizon. And here's what I do. I use Wikipedia. I read The Economist every week from cover to cover. I read Bloomberg News and as much of the Wall Street Journal as I can get for free, and peer-reviewed journal articles. The publications of the National Association of Science, Nature, Science, and any others that I can find. And Snopes. You really got to find out, go to Snopes.com and find out what Snopes is. Very good debunking site. And it's not political. They debunk left as much as they debunk right. Ars Technica is a great website, for those of you who don't know, to find very reliable information on a lot of things, not so much socio-political, but a lot of things like cybercrime and finance and new technological information. Ars Technica is a wonderful place where they have great journalists. Recommended reading. The book I've been talking about the whole time is Jonathan Haidt, and that's The Righteous Mind. The second book he wrote a couple of years ago was a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, where he really takes a lot of the liberal left university system to task for raising a generation of people who are so vulnerable that they cannot even have political discussions. And very interesting reading. Then there's Donald Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. My idol, Steven Pinker, a man whom I met only once, had one conversation with him at Microsoft. He's at Harvard. He is, to my way of thinking, the single best prose writer in the English language for information. And read The Blank Slate. I know it's 800 pages, but it will give you a new look on life. And The Better Angels of Our Nature is one of the greatest examinations of the reality of the decline of violence over the last 20,000 years. Then, if you really want to know how badly we think, read The Knowledge Illusion or Irrationality. They cover some of the same ground, and they talk about how our natural human instincts to reason are terrible. They really don't work. We don't solve puzzles. We don't reason. We don't know how to use probabilities. We don't know what randomness is. We're just no damn good at it. And the only way to get good at it is to be humble and recognize you're not good at it and try to get some training. Those books will help you with that. These are actual live links in the PDF that you can click on to get to Jonathan Haidt's website, to get to his book site, to get to some of these reference articles in Wikipedia that I used to put this together today, and a very interesting article on PNAS about exposure of opposing views on social media can increase political polarization. In other words, when people tell someone, no, the fact is this, the fact is that, those people typically go away even more convinced that they're right. Now, this seems almost counterintuitive, but whatever it may be, it's human nature. We want to hold on to our treasured beliefs and not let them go at all. And yet, I believe, as modern human beings, we must. This is about me. You can read this if you want to. I thank you all for your time, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
David, if you will look in the chat, there's a question there that maybe you could address.
So, Elaine, your concern is people who are putting out misinformation?
Especially people that identify themselves as medical people, like doctors, nurses. Somebody was on Talk of the Villages today that said they were a nurse and they gave all these credentials and talked about all these things that I truly believe are not correct. And it's because I believe that it's because I've researched the vaccine. I researched mRNAs and how they came about. And so it drives me nuts when I see people that identify themselves as medical professionals and I know they're putting misinformation out. And then after that, a couple other people said, oh, that's very true. Oh, that sounds great. Right on. And I'm concerned. Yeah.
I have no overall solution for people who lie.
Okay.
Fundamental human dishonesty is beyond my purview. Okay. What I will say is that the thing to counter that is there was an article. What I would do is a tit for tat. There was an article yesterday that said that they have been measuring the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine in several countries and found that on the streets, it's 95% effective, just like they thought, and that virtually no one has had any bad symptoms and no one has died. Not a single person has died. Some people have felt kind of shitty for a couple of days. That's extremely rare. And you know what? I worked with medical people. I actually did. I'm not one. And in the medical industry, it's well known that there's no such thing as a risk-free procedure. Because even if you want to take people's blood pressure, guess what? They have to drive to the doctor's office. And 1 in 100,000 is going to have a serious accident driving to the doctor's office. So there's no free lunch. But all I would do is I would say, read this. And the other thing is, honestly, I simply avoid listening to a lot of this stuff because you're not going to fix the problem. You need to keep your head clean and clear and understand and reach out to those who actually want to understand, because there will always be that. I mean, like I said, somebody that I know quite well believed in Bigfoot, right? You know what happened with Bigfoot? As DNA testing got really, really cheap, virtually every animal on the planet got its DNA sequenced. The Human Genome Project cost $10 billion. Sequencing a panda cost like 50 cents. Okay, they did that. Not a big deal. Then what they did was they went back to these sites that where they had thought they found Bigfoot or Bigfoot's feces or Bigfoot's fur, Bigfoot toenails, whatever, and they got them out of Bigfoot museums and got them out of out of people's collections. They actually DNA sequenced everything they could find, both mitochondrial and nuclear, if they could get nuclear, depending on how old the thing was. And those that were actually animals were almost all from bears. They actually found a kind of bear that hasn't been around in a while, that actually found fur from a bear that hasn't lived in a couple thousand years. So maybe it was there. So what I'm saying is they have actually proven they ain't no Bigfoot. Hello. But you can still get on the the A&E channel or Discovery Channel, and they've got those Bigfoot hunters out there to this day, even though every scrap of Bigfoot material has been DNA sequenced, and there ain't no Bigfoot. So you can't fix it.
Well, my main concern is the other people who may believe this stuff and then not get the vaccine, get the virus, and actually die.
Well, stupidity can be painful. That's and stupidity can actually be fatal too. So what I'm saying is, if you just put in there an article that says that proof on the ground is that virtually no one got sick, and it is 95% effective, which is much higher than the flu vaccine. In a good year, the flu vaccine is 60% effective. So if you're telling people, have you ever had the flu vaccine? If they say yes, then you say, if you're not taking the Pfizer vaccine, you're an idiot. Okay. This is how I talk. This is the real me. I don't have a lot of compassion. I'm not very agreeable. Stupid people are stupid people are stupid people. But you can give them just one little article and go on. But my advice to you very personally is have a nice life. You're not in charge.
Well, you know, one point they made that was like this was developed overnight, but
No, it was not.
my research shows that they've been working on messenger RNA for 20 years. It wasn't developed
In
overnight.
fact, the fact is that they had developed a vaccine using mRNA technology for the original SARS,
Yeah.
okay, which is really, really close. So it wasn't, they weren't inventing the wheel. They were
No.
tweaking the Ford to make it, you know, you have a higher mileage. I'm going to get a little technical here. Remember, I was talking about what a theory, what a model is. You can have a model of the weather. You can have a model of nuclear physics. You can have a model of the Big Bang. You can have a model of ocean, which is 5 dimensions. And then there's either 5 or 6 in moral foundations theory. And then Kahneman has fast and slow. If you add that all up, you come out with 13 dimensions, right? The reality is they're probably measuring some of the same stuff. In other words, probably some of the moral foundations are similar to things in ocean. And then you have the thinking fast and slow. And if we took this whole thing and made a multi-dimensional model of that included a version of ocean, included moral foundations theory, included thinking fast and slow, and maybe a little bit of Maslow, and maybe a little bit of Seligman's happiness and a few other things, then you could have a model that would encompass far more of human behavior in the large than we have today. And you could probably also reduce the dimensions. PCA is a mathematical technique for figuring out whether you've got enough dimensions or too many dimensions. And the resulting theory would encompass human psychology, individual non-pathological behavior, collective choice making and group behavior, and individual belief formation. And then we have to measure and quantify the influences. One of my heroes is a man named Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, who was an Italian-American geneticist and scientist who was the first one who pioneered analyzing DNA to figure out about human migrations around the world. And after he did that, he did a bunch of seminal work in the 50s trying to figure out, based on our DNA, how much of our personality and belief is genetic versus nurture versus where we grew up. Although his methodology is primitive by today's standards, he came to the same conclusion everybody else does. And you know what that conclusion is? It's 50-50. We are half nature and half nurture. And most of that nature stops when we reach working age. Many times it stops when we're 7 years old, depending on whom you believe. So the question is, what are we measuring and what do we attribute it to? The reality is we need to go back to a lot of psychology and say, not how to deal with this stuff, but how do we deal with it given the fact that this person is like this? In other words, I'm a guitar player. I teach students sometimes. Some students have small hands. When a student has a small hand, I need to recognize what they need to do with the kind of guitar they buy and how they use their hand to compensate for the fact that they've got a small hand. This is what has to happen in psychology. We need to figure out more about where people were, what was born in them and what they have learned as children, so that we can reach them where they live very quickly without having to go through, like I had in the 1970s, 3 years of therapy to kind of get down to the fact that occasionally I'm a jerk, right? That wasn't the only take-home message, but it was one of them, you know? We need to measure that. And then the one that really drives me crazy, I'm reading again Robert Hare's wonderful book about sociopaths, psychopaths. Do you know Robert Hare? He's at UBC, University of British Columbia. He's the guy who wrote the sociopath checklist. Well, my problem is every time I read something like that, I think, where's the model of psychiatric pathology? Where is the dimensional model for the DSM? The DSM is like a gardening manual. You know, you want to recognize a rose. Well, a rose has green stems and it grows to be about 2 feet tall and it's got thorns and it's got leaves that look like this and it blooms once a year and yada, yada, yada. That's descriptive. That's butterfly collecting. Where is an actual model for all of the different things that happen in psychiatry? Is schizophrenia and depression absolutely distinct diseases? I even don't like to use the word disease. And I'm frustrated by the fact that I've been studying this stuff all my life, and I see them no closer to an overall ontological model for psychiatric pathology than they were when I was a baby. And that's frustrating. Yes, Bonnie.
Okay, I was just going to see if you could move to the very last slide about TLC.
Ah, yes, indeed.
So while he's getting that slide up, TLC is Transition Life Consultants, and there are about 25 of us volunteers in the mental health field. We're all retired, and we volunteer our time, and all of our services are free of charge. But we do have some expenses, and so we ask for donations when it's possible. And what we provide are trainings, support groups. Right now we have 3 support groups that are ongoing. One is for caregivers of people with serious illnesses, and it's called What About Me? And we focus on their needs so that they can help the people that they're caring for. We have a Coping When You're Alone group for people who live alone, especially difficult during the pandemic, as you can imagine. And then Bonnie had already talked about our Way to Go group, and that's WEIGH, and that's for people who are serious about losing weight and keeping it off. And we use a psychological model with hypnotherapy as part of that. And that's run many times and is very, very successful. We do presentations to the community. Bonnie did one this morning on compassion. That was really good, very enlightening. We've had quite a few of them during COVID time. Thanks to David's help in getting us started with the website and learning how to do presentations. We've been very, very busy during COVID, probably even busier than we were prior to that. And a lot of our presentations are videotaped and are on our YouTube channel that you can find on the TLC website. And as you can see on this slide, tlc-services.org. And you can find lots of information about us there. On the events and information page, there is that big YouTube button where you can look at our videos. And many of them are very informative. In addition to doing presentations, we do a limited amount of one-on-one counseling as we have availability. There are not a ton of us doing counseling, so we normally do more brief sessions, but we try to help people who are suffering and who are having difficult times. And for those of us who did this in our pre-retirement years, being part of TLC has been really rewarding, and we feel like we've made a little bit of a difference in our community. So check us out on tlcservices.org, and soon David will edit and clean up the presentation that Bonnie and he gave today, and it will also be available on our website.
Thanks.
So thank you for coming. We appreciate your attention, your questions, and we'll see you next time.